In the cold silence of the night, the sound of footsteps echoed through London's empty streets. Jonathan Hart, a renowned magnate, stopped beside a dark alley, drawn by the muffled sobs of a child. Curled up on the ground, a girl with tangled hair clutched a piece of stale bread as though it were her most precious treasure. Her vacant stare hit him like a blow. He hesitated for a moment, but something in his heart, hardened by years of luxury, cracked open. Without a second thought, he extended his hand. "Come with me," he said firmly, little imagining how that simple act would change his life. Jonathan Hart, the owner of one of the largest investment firms in the UK, sat at the pinnacle of the social ladder. Yet, he carried within him an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. His world was defined by expensive watches and unmissable commitments. Every day began with a calendar already full of meetings, contracts to review, and gala events to attend alongside his wife, Clara. Their home in Mayfair, a grand mansion, was a testament to their status, every detail meticulously designed to impress. Clara, a lifelong socialite, made perfection her mission. That particular morning, Clara was pacing the living room, deliberating where to place floral arrangements for an upcoming dinner party. "Jonathan," she called out sweetly but firmly, "have you confirmed our attendance at the charity event next week? The BBC cameras will be there." Jonathan, engrossed in a financial report, looked up slowly. "I'll confirm, Clara." His response was automatic, as though he already knew the question had less to do with the event itself and more with their public image. Mary, the head housekeeper, entered the room carrying a silver tray. She carefully placed a cup of tea in front of Clara and a glass of juice for Jonathan. There was something about Mary, a weariness in her expression that her immaculate uniform couldn't hide. Unlike Clara, who seemed born for opulence, Mary was a constant reminder that not everyone in the Hart's orbit belonged to their world of privilege. Meanwhile, across town, a completely different world buzzed with life. In Brixton, the smoky scent of food stalls mingled with damp asphalt. Vendors shouted their deals, children darted through alleys, and weary eyes watched the rhythm of the day unfold. This was a world where many never even dreamed of the luxury of Mayfair. Among the crowd was a small girl who stood out. Her hair was a mix of dust and unruly curls, and her clothes, handed down through countless owners, seemed to carry stories of their own. For her, each day began with a glimmer of hope to find something, anything, that could be traded for food. The stale bread an elderly woman had discarded yesterday was the best meal she'd had in days. Her steps were quick, her eyes sharp. She knew how to avoid trouble, though trouble often found her anyway. On a busy street corner, a group of older boys tried to snatch her bread, but she was faster, darting into an alley only the smallest dared to enter. In that moment, two lives so vastly different were about to collide, though neither could yet foresee it. Back at the mansion, Clara continued issuing orders to the staff, perfecting every detail of an upcoming event. This was her forte, creating flawless occasions that reinforced the Hart's polished image. For her, Jonathan was the ideal partner, but not for reasons of love. He was a respected figure, and together they formed a couple admired by all, at least on the surface. Jonathan, however, felt increasingly burdened by that life. While Clara busied herself with impressing guests, he was growing more aware of the chasm between them. Meetings that once excited him now felt hollow, his thoughts drifting more often to the past. The suffocating nature of wealth was becoming undeniable. "Jonathan, don't you think we should renovate the ballroom?" Clara suggested over lunch. "It's perfect the way it is," he replied absently. "Perfect is not good enough," Clara replied with a cold smile. The conversation at lunch had drifted into silence as Mary quietly cleared the plates. Jonathan knew this was just another of Clara's attempts to maintain appearances. She saw no need for change in their marriage, or in any other aspect of their lives, as long as no one on the outside noticed a crack. Later that evening, Jonathan decided to go out for a walk, something he often used as an excuse to escape the tensions at home. It was a habit Clara despised, but one he stubbornly refused to give up. He left with no particular destination, though his mind was always weighed down by questions he didn't dare answer. That night, his wandering took him far beyond the boundaries of Mayfair. What began as a distracted stroll turned into something more meaningful as he crossed into areas he hadn't visited in years. The sounds of the streets, the smell of food from vendor carts, and the buzz of human life transported him back to a time when his life was far less complicated. Without realizing it, he found himself in Brixton, observing people who barely noticed his presence. The solitude he often felt amidst the luxury of his life clashed brutally with the vibrant, albeit chaotic, energy of these streets. Jonathan walked through Brixton with hesitant steps, soaking in every detail around him. The energy of the streets pulsed chaotically, yet it felt alive, like an unruly symphony. The shouts of vendors echoed from every corner, advertising fresh fruit and second-hand clothes. Children darted through the crowds, laughing carefree as they weaved between the bustling passers-by. It was a world so far removed from the stifling silence of Mayfair that, for a brief moment, Jonathan felt as though he were in a different country. As he passed a makeshift market, a man with a broad grin and sharp eyes approached him, holding a small leather pouch that he jiggled slightly to grab Jonathan's attention. "Oi, mate. You've struck gold tonight. Found myself a proper Rolex, genuine article. And at a price you won't believe." Jonathan stopped, suspicious. It was clear the man had pegged him as an outsider. "I'm not interested," Jonathan replied with a measured tone, but the man persisted, opening the pouch to reveal a watch that gleamed faintly under a nearby street lamp. "Only asking 50 quid, mate. It's worth at least $1,000, perfect for someone special." Before Jonathan could respond, an elderly man, seated on a makeshift wooden chair at the corner of the street, intervened. "Don't fall for it, lad. He's been flogging knockoffs to tourists for years." The con man shot the old man an annoyed glare, muttering something under his breath before slinking off into the crowd. Jonathan gave the old man a nod of thanks, struck by the honesty of the stranger. As he continued his walk, Jonathan began to notice more than just the sights and sounds of the area. In one corner, a group of teenagers rapped in rhythm, clapping their hands to create a beat. Their raw talent and passion were unmistakable, but Jonathan also noticed their frayed clothes and patched-up trainers. The scene stood in stark contrast to the impeccably dressed young people he saw at social events, always glued to the screens of their expensive phones. A short while later, Jonathan stopped outside a convenience store with cracked glass doors. Inside, a woman was arguing with the cashier, who insisted she couldn't take a can of soup without paying. "I'll pay by the end of the day, I promise. I just need it for my kids," she pleaded, but the man behind the counter wouldn't budge. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat as the woman left empty-handed, her head bowed. A small boy, likely her son, tugged at her skirt, his tearful eyes wide with confusion. Jonathan kept walking, but the images lingered in his mind. He passed a queue outside a community center where people waited patiently. Some clutched parcels of donated food, while others stood in line for a hot meal. For the first time, Jonathan truly saw a life driven not by excess, but by need. He thought of the food wasted in his own home, of the lavish gala dinners where dishes were served only to be left aside. Unknowingly, Jonathan's steps had led him to a small park in the heart of the neighborhood. The place was unkempt, with rusted swings and splintered wooden benches, yet it carried a kind of tranquility that was distinctly different from the chaos of the streets. He chose a bench beneath the shade of a tree and sat down. His shoulders were tense, and his mind felt burdened by the scenes he had witnessed. Taking a deep breath, he gazed at the overcast sky. For the first time in years, he felt detached from his own world, yet oddly connected to something larger, something he couldn't quite define. Sitting there on that simple bench, Jonathan wondered how many times he had ignored the existence of such a reality. He knew that when he returned to Mayfair, he could pretend none of this had happened. But there was something in the faces he had seen, in the eyes filled with untold stories, that made him doubt whether forgetting was even possible. It was then that a faint sound caught his attention. His eyes wandered across the park, taking in the surroundings. Not far away, he spotted a middle-aged man bent over the bonnet of an old car, visibly frustrated. The vehicle sputtered with a series of failed ignitions, and the man, his hand smeared with grease, shook his head in resignation. Jonathan remained seated, still lost in thought, yet unable to look away. Moments later, another man, perhaps a local, approached with a battered toolbox. He offered his help with a simple gesture, and the two began working on the car together. They exchanged few words, but a natural camaraderie was evident. Within 10 minutes, the engine coughed to life with a shaky yet hopeful rumble. The car owner grinned widely, shaking the other man's hand with heartfelt gratitude. Jonathan watched the scene unfold, intrigued. In his world, a selfless gesture like that was rare, almost non-existent. He turned his gaze elsewhere and noticed a group of children near a tree. At first, he assumed they were playing, but it soon became clear they were trying to climb the low branches. One of them, a girl with long hair, clung determinedly to a branch while two others cheered her on, laughing. Jonathan couldn't help but smile, until their giggles turned into mischievous laughter. They had reached a bird's nest and were carefully removing the eggs, placing them onto a piece of cardboard on the ground. "Oi, leave those alone," shouted a passing woman, startling the group. The children dropped the eggs and dashed away, disappearing behind a low fence. Jonathan shook his head, unsure whether to be irritated by the mischief or amused by the boundless energy of youth. Not long after, his attention shifted to a different group, standing further away. 3 teenage boys, all dressed in worn-out clothes, were speaking loudly and gesturing aggressively. One of them kicked an empty soda can, the metallic clang echoing through the nearly deserted park. Jonathan recognized the barely restrained hostility in their movements. They were the same boys he had seen harassing a street vendor earlier. Something about them held his focus. One of the boys clutched something in his hands, a piece of bread, which he tore into bits as he laughed with the others. Jonathan felt a growing unease. He was certain it was the same group that caused trouble in the neighborhood, likely the ones who made the area a place of fear for the more vulnerable. Rising from the bench, Jonathan hesitated. But something drove him to follow the boys. He watched as they slipped into a narrow alley between 2 old buildings. The space was dark, the walls scrawled with faded graffiti and streaks of grime. The stench of damp and rubbish filled the air, but Jonathan kept walking. He could hear their voices echoing in the distance, but couldn't make out the words. Turning a corner, he found himself alone. The alley was cramped and claustrophobic, lit only by a single, flickering bulb that hung loosely from above. He stopped, scanning the area, but the boys had vanished like shadows. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of something intangible pressing on him. The silence of the alley was suffocating, and for a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake by following them. It was then, in the distance, that he heard the faint sound of a sob. After running endlessly from the boys, the little girl, who to many had no name or face worth remembering, found herself alone. To the street's inhabitants, she was just another small, thin shadow moving between Brixton's alleys, always searching for something to keep her alive for one more day. She had escaped into the alley after the boys had chased her, trying to steal her precious piece of bread. Darting through puddles and rubbish-strewn streets, her heart raced so hard it felt like it might leap from her chest. She eventually found refuge in a forgotten corner of the alley, where a torn old sofa and a piece of cardboard served as her makeshift shelter. Curling up there, she clutched the bread against her chest like it was a treasure. Her trembling hands tore off a small piece, which she quickly shoved into her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Her eyes scanned the alley, sharp and alert for any sound that might signal danger. She knew the boys might come back, but she also knew there was nowhere else to go. This was her routine: escape, hide, survive. When the last bit of bread was gone, she pulled a filthy coat she'd found in the rubbish weeks ago around her and tried to shield herself from the bitter wind that cut through the narrow passage. The day dragged on with cruel slowness. The girl watched people walking along the main street, but no one even glanced her way. For a moment, she considered asking for help, but she'd already learned that no one stopped for children like her. The last time she'd tried, she was chased away like a stray dog. Still, hunger was a force she couldn't ignore. As dusk settled, she decided to leave the alley and explore the busier streets. Her bare feet carried her to the market, where the smell of warm food made her hunger ache even more. She edged closer to a vendor who'd carelessly left a crate of fruit on the ground. Carefully, she pulled an apple from the corner of the box. She nearly slipped away unnoticed, but the vendor's shout made her run again, gripping the fruit tightly like it was a prize from battle. When night fell, she returned to the park where she sometimes slept. Exhausted, she knew she couldn't rest just yet. As she crept through the trees, she heard familiar voices. The boys. They were too close, laughing and throwing stones at each other. Fear gripped her, but before she could decide which way to run, a figure appeared in the distance, stepping into the alley where she often hid. Jonathan. He walked slowly, his brow furrowed, his gaze searching as if he were looking for something. The girl spotted him and froze. She didn't know whether this man was a threat or a savior. He looked out of place here, with his clean clothes and deliberate steps, but there was something in his expression that made her sink further into the shadows, watching. Jonathan continued forward, his attention drawn to the sound of a muffled sob. The faint noise led him to the end of the alley, where at last he found her. The girl was huddled against the wall, her wide eyes filled with fear. She clutched the apple tightly, as if ready to fight for it, even though her frail body betrayed any sense of menace. "Hey," he said softly, his voice low and careful. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't answer, her wary gaze fixed on him. Jonathan hesitated, then slowly removed his coat and took a small step closer. "You're cold," he said, holding it out to her. She looked at the coat, then at him. The silence between them was heavy, thick with tension, until finally, she reached out her small, dirt-streaked hand to take it. In that moment, Jonathan felt something inside him shift, a connection he hadn't anticipated, compassion that was stronger than anything he'd felt in years. "Come with me," he said, his voice firmer now. She looked at him again, as if weighing the risk, but then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she chose to trust. Jonathan took her hand gently and led her out of the alley. That night, under the flickering streetlights, he knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Jonathan and the girl walked side by side through the streets of Brixton, the silence between them filled only by the steady rhythm of their footsteps against the cobblestones and the faint hum of the city around them. He held the coat he'd draped over her shoulders, pulling it snugly to shield her from the biting cold wind of the evening. The girl kept her gaze forward, wary, but clutching the apple tightly in her small hands. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked, breaking the quiet. The girl glanced at him but didn't answer immediately. Her small, dirt-streaked face was partially hidden by the oversized coat she gripped tightly. Jonathan didn't push. He understood it wasn't easy to trust someone, especially someone like him, who looked so out of place in this world, a clean, polished man in a place that wore its struggles on its sleeve. After a few steps, she mumbled something, so faint it was almost swallowed by the wind. "Don't have one." Jonathan stopped for a moment, surprised by her answer. "What do you mean, you don't have one?" She shrugged, as though the question itself was pointless. "Doesn't matter," she said, her voice quiet, her eyes avoiding his. He wanted to press further but realized it wasn't the right time. Instead, he changed the subject, nodding towards the apple she still held. "Do you like apples?" The question sounded odd, even to him, but the girl glanced at the fruit in her hand and gave a small shrug. "It's just food," she replied bluntly, though her voice seemed less guarded now. Jonathan chuckled softly, more out of nervousness than amusement. "Fair enough. But you should eat it. You look like you haven't eaten all day." She hesitated, then took a small, cautious bite. The way she held the apple, almost protectively, made Jonathan realize this might have been her first proper meal in days. He decided not to say anything, just kept walking at a steady pace so she could keep up. "Do you live near here?" he tried again, gesturing vaguely at the streets around them. The girl shook her head. "I live wherever I can." Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply murmured, "I see." She stopped walking for a moment and looked directly at him for the first time. Her large, tired eyes carried a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Why do you bring me with you? Why do you care?" The question caught him off guard. Jonathan opened his mouth to reply but realized he didn't have a clear answer. He thought back to the moment he saw her huddled in that alley, so small and vulnerable, and the instinct that had compelled him to act. It was hard to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "I don't know," he admitted after a pause. It just felt like the right thing to do. She tilted her head slightly, as though weighing whether or not to believe him. But instead of pressing further, she took another bite of the apple and started walking again. The journey felt easier after that. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them felt less heavy now. The girl began glancing around, as if mentally mapping the streets they passed, while Jonathan led her towards Mayfair. When his mansion came into view, glowing and imposing in the distance, the girl stopped in her tracks, her posture stiffening. She stared at the house, then at him, her eyes narrowing. "Is that yours?" Jonathan nodded. "It is. Don't worry, though. You'll be safe." She didn't reply, but her hesitation was clear. Jonathan stayed beside her, waiting patiently until she took a deep breath and took a step towards the grand entrance. As they climbed the front steps, Jonathan looked at her again. She was filthy, exhausted, but there was something about her, a quiet strength, that struck him deeply. He knew that bringing her into his home was just the beginning of something he didn't fully understand yet. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. He opened the door, and the two of them stepped inside, the grand, gleaming corridors of the Hart mansion stretching out before them. The sound of voices reached Jonathan's ears almost immediately, echoing from the main hall. Laughter and polite conversation buzzed in the air before he even saw the guests. The lights shone brighter than usual, reflecting off crystal glasses and the gilded moldings of the doorways. Standing near the grand staircase was Clara, perfectly poised in an elegant navy blue gown that seemed designed to intimidate more than impress. She spotted him the moment he crossed the hall. "Jonathan," she exclaimed, striding towards him with quick, determined steps. "You're late. The guests are already here, and where have you been? Couldn't you have picked a better day to get lost in London's streets?" Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Clara continued before he could get a word in. "The ambassador arrived early, and I've had to entertain him on my own. You know how crucial he is to our charity work. We need to appear united, Jonathan." United? As she spoke, Jonathan felt the small figure beside him shrink further into herself. The girl clutched his coat tightly, her wide eyes fixed on the polished floor beneath her feet. She wasn't accustomed to places like this, nor to the people who inhabited them. Clara, too wrapped up in her reprimand, hadn't noticed the child's presence. Jonathan, on the other hand, subtly shifted his body to shield the girl from his wife's view, fully aware that now wasn't the time for explanations. But then, the girl, trying to adjust the oversized coat draped over her, made a small noise, the sound of something dropping from a pocket, perhaps a crumb of bread or a stray button. Clara froze instantly. Her gaze fell upon the small, scruffy figure standing beside Jonathan. For a moment, she seemed incapable of processing what she was seeing. Then her expression shifted, moving from confusion to something closer to horror. "Jonathan," she began, her voice slow and measured, but brimming with a growing fury, "what is that?" He tried to respond calmly. "Clara, please, hear me out. This is a girl, a girl," she interrupted, her voice rising sharply. "You've brought a dirty child into our home. And on the evening of such an important dinner." Clara stepped back as though the child's presence was something infectious. Her eyes narrowed, and she folded her arms stiffly across her chest, clearly trying to keep her composure. "This cannot be serious, Jonathan. What were you thinking? Have you completely lost your senses?" The girl, feeling the weight of Clara's outburst, took a step back, but Jonathan gently held her hand, keeping her close. He turned to Clara, his tone calmer than she had expected. "Clara, she needed help. I couldn't just leave her where she was." "Help?" Clara let out a humorless laugh, her eyes full of disbelief. "And what about our reputation? What will our guests think if they see this? You've brought someone off the streets into our home, Jonathan. This is outrageous." Jonathan took a deep breath, striving to remain patient. "Our reputation, Clara, is not more important than the life of a child." His words hung in the air for a moment. Clara stared at him as though she no longer recognized him. She opened her mouth to retort, but the arrival of a guest in the hall cut through the tension. "Mr. Hart, Lady Hart," the man greeted, offering a polite smile before sensing the charged atmosphere. Clara quickly regained her composure, shooting a withering glance at Jonathan, then at the girl. "I'll deal with this later," she muttered through clenched teeth before turning to the guest with a bright, false smile. "Do come in, Lord Spencer. It's a pleasure to have you with us." As Clara disappeared with the guest towards the dining room, Jonathan knelt beside the girl, who was watching him with a mix of fear and confusion. "It's all right," he said softly. "I promise, it'll be all right." But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Jonathan took a steadying breath after Clara vanished down the hall with the guest. He knew this wasn't over, but now wasn't the time for arguments. He looked at the girl at his side, still clutching the coat as though it were a shield. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, but her shoulders were tense, ready to bolt at any moment. "Mary," he called, turning to the head housekeeper, who had just entered the hall carrying a tray of crystal glasses. Mary stopped in her tracks at the sound of his voice, her curious gaze falling on the unusual scene before her. "Mr. Hart?" she inquired, approaching cautiously. Her eyes settled on the girl, and though her expression remained neutral, Jonathan caught the faint crease of her brow, subtle, but unmistakable. "I need you to look after her for a bit," Jonathan said, gesturing to the girl. "Get her something to eat, maybe a bath, some clean clothes, something comfortable." Mary set the tray down and gave the girl a closer look. She didn't say anything at first, but her sharp eyes seemed to notice more than she let on. The girl, meanwhile, shrank back slightly, clutching the coat tightly around her. "She'll be fine with you," Jonathan added, trying to sound reassuring. He glanced down at the girl. "I need to get ready for the dinner. But I'll be back soon, all right?" The girl didn't answer but gave a small, hesitant nod, still wary. Mary finally broke the silence. "Of course, Mr. Hart. I'll take care of her." Jonathan lingered for a moment as if he wanted to say more, but in the end, he just nodded his thanks and headed upstairs. The weight of the evening ahead pressed heavily on him, and he needed a moment to compose himself before facing Clara again. As he disappeared to the upper floor, Mary crouched down to the girl's level, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp and observant. "Come on, then," she said, her voice soft but firm. The girl hesitated for a moment before taking a cautious step forward, her movements slow and deliberate as she followed Mary down the hallway. As they made their way towards the servants' quarters, Mary couldn't shake an odd feeling about the situation. There was something familiar about the girl, something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was her eyes or the way she clung to Jonathan's coat like a lifeline. But Mary, ever discreet and experienced, said nothing. When they reached the kitchen, Mary pulled out a chair for the girl to sit on and began preparing something warm and simple to eat. As she stirred a pot on the stove, she cast another glance at the small figure sitting at the table. A faint chill ran down her spine. Yes, there was something about this child that she couldn't ignore. Something that made her feel that this encounter was more than just chance. Mary kept stirring the pot in silence, her thoughts swirling as much as the soup. Every so often, she stole subtle glances at the girl, who sat curled up on the chair, her small feet swinging back and forth. The child avoided Mary's gaze, her fingers nervously playing with the edges of Jonathan's coat. When the soup was ready, Mary ladled a steaming bowl and placed it in front of the girl. "Here, have some of this. It'll warm you up," she said calmly, her tone gentle but watchful. The girl eyed the bowl warily at first, but the smell seemed to convince her. She took the spoon in her small, grubby hands and tried a cautious sip. Feeling the comforting warmth slide down her throat, she quickly took another, this time a little faster. Mary sat across from her, arms crossed, quietly observing. As the girl ate, Mary tried to start a conversation, careful not to scare her off. "So, Mr. Hart found you on the street, did he?" The girl nodded slightly, not lifting her eyes from the bowl. "Were you on your own?" The girl paused, letting the spoon rest in the bowl. After a long silence, she murmured, "I'm always on my own." Mary drew in a slow breath. Something about that answer tightened a knot in her chest. She knew what it was to feel alone, even when surrounded by people. But there was something else, a deeper unease she couldn't explain. When the girl finished the soup, Mary fetched a clean towel and some plain clothes from the service quarters. "Let's get you cleaned up. You'll feel better," she said. The girl hesitated, but Mary offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'll help you." As she bathed her, Mary couldn't ignore the small details that only deepened her unease. Faint scars on the girl's arms. The way her shoulders flinched slightly at sudden movements, as though bracing for something that never came. When they were done, Mary helped her into the clean clothes and brushed out her tangled curls, trying to tame them into some semblance of order. By the time they finished, the girl looked almost unrecognizable. Still thin, still quiet, but with a less guarded expression, as though some of the tension had eased from her small frame. Mary led her back to the kitchen and sat her down again. Before Mary could ask anything more, Jonathan appeared, descending the staircase. He was now impeccably dressed for the dinner, his suit pressed, his hair still damp but neatly combed. His expression was composed, almost steely, like a man ready to step into battle. "Is she all right?" Jonathan asked, glancing between Mary and the girl. "She is," Mary replied, though there was a slight hesitation in her voice that Jonathan picked up on immediately. A warm meal and a bath seemed to have done her some good. Jonathan nodded but couldn't help noticing that Mary appeared preoccupied. "Is something wrong?" Mary shook her head quickly, masking her thoughts. "No, sir. It's just an unusual situation, wouldn't you say?" "Undoubtedly," Jonathan murmured, sitting briefly beside the girl. He watched her for a moment. Now clean, she looked even younger than he'd imagined. "Are you comfortable?" The girl gave a faint nod but stayed silent. Jonathan lifted his gaze to Mary again. He knew she was observant, sometimes more than he would like. But the look in her eyes now, a mix of doubt and recognition, unnerved him. "Mary," he said in a quieter tone, "if you've got something to say, say it." Mary pressed her lips together, as though weighing her words. Finally, she said softly, "She seems familiar to me, sir. But perhaps it's just a feeling." Jonathan frowned. "Familiar? In what way?" Mary glanced at the girl, who was now fiddling with the edge of a folded towel in her lap. The room fell into a heavy silence, as if the answer was just out of reach, but not yet ready to be spoken aloud. "I'll need a bit of time to think," Mary said at last, standing and picking up the empty bowl from the table. "I've got my suspicions, but I need to be sure." Jonathan didn't press her. He knew Mary wasn't one to speak without reason. Instead, he stood and cast one last look at the girl before murmuring, "Stay with her. Don't leave her alone." Mary nodded, but as Jonathan walked away, memories began to surface in her mind like pieces of a puzzle trying to fit together. She knew she needed to figure it out, and quickly. Because this girl wasn't a stranger, not to her. The Hart Mansion's dining hall was a masterpiece of elegance, meticulously arranged to impress even the most demanding guests. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the long, polished table set with gleaming wine glasses and fine porcelain plates. The air was filled with the aroma of gourmet dishes prepared by London's finest chefs. Clara, as always, was at the center of it all. Her smile was as rehearsed as the details of the event, and she floated between guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess, exchanging polite words and laughing at precisely the right moments. To the others, she was perfection, but beneath the polished exterior, she was simmering with anger. Her eyes flicked repeatedly towards the entrance of the hall, waiting for Jonathan to appear. When he finally entered, his expression calm and his suit immaculate, she greeted him with a look of pure exasperation. At last, she muttered under her breath, keeping her smile fixed for the guests. "You took so long." Lord Spencer nearly asked if you'd gone to another continent. Jonathan simply nodded, adjusting his tie and brushing off her sharp tone. He knew this night was going to be a long one. The guests were lively, discussing everything from investments to the latest social gossip. Lord Spencer, a stout man with a neatly trimmed moustache, seemed particularly taken with Clara, laughing heartily at her every remark, no matter how mundane. Jonathan watched the scene from his seat, but his mind was elsewhere. As the main courses were served, Jonathan barely touched his food. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl, and what Mary had said. She seems familiar. How? Why? And what did it mean? At one point, one of the guests, Lady Edith, a sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued older woman, directed a question at him. "So, Mr. Hart, I hear your company is expanding into the Asian market. You must be exhausted with all the extra work." Jonathan looked up, realizing a moment too late that he was expected to respond. Clearing his throat, he quickly composed himself. "That's correct, Lady Edith. But hard work always pays off in the end." Clara jumped in with a quick smile, shifting the focus back to herself. "Jonathan has been tireless with work, but he knows how to balance business and social commitments. That's why we can host events like this, even in the midst of so much going on." The conversation carried on, but Jonathan barely registered it. He noticed Clara watching him from the corner of her eye, trying to gauge what was on his mind. He knew that if she realized his thoughts were on the girl downstairs, the situation would escalate all over again. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Mary sat quietly, observing the girl. She was scribbling on a scrap of paper with an old pencil Mary had found for her. The girl seemed calmer now, but Mary wasn't. Memories were beginning to resurface, memories of a time she had tried so hard to forget. In the dining hall, laughter echoed, and wine glasses clinked, but for Jonathan, the sounds felt distant and hollow. He glanced at Clara, who was captivating the guests with stories carefully curated to leave them in awe. Jonathan realized, with a weary clarity, that this dinner, like so many others, was nothing more than a performance. And he was starting to wonder if he wanted to keep playing his part. He leaned back in his chair as the waitstaff cleared the plates from the main course and began serving dessert, a delicate chocolate mousse adorned with edible gold leaf. The conversation around the table grew livelier, fueled by generous helpings of wine and the meticulously crafted atmosphere Clara had orchestrated. Lord Spencer, now noticeably more relaxed, leaned towards Jonathan. "Hart, I hear you've got plans for a new charitable foundation." Clara mentioned something about helping underprivileged children. "Admirable, old chapter, truly admirable." Jonathan almost laughed at the irony. Clara, who had been furious about helping a real child just moments ago, was now championing the cause of altruism as though it were her life's purpose. Keeping his expression neutral, he replied, "Yes, we're still in the early stages of planning. The goal is to create something tangible, something that genuinely makes a difference." Clara interjected smoothly, her voice warm and polished. "Jonathan has been a visionary with this project. He believes we can make a real impact, and I wholeheartedly agree. After all, it's our responsibility to give back." Jonathan glanced at Clara but said nothing. He knew this was just part of her act, another attempt to reinforce the image of the perfect Hart couple. Meanwhile, just outside the dining room, Mary stood in the kitchen corridor, catching faint echoes of the conversation. But her mind was far from the glittering dinner party. She turned to look at the girl, who was now perched on a small stool, toying with a leftover piece of bread from the soup. Mary still couldn't shake the feeling that something about the child was hauntingly familiar. The girl's eyes, her expression, the way she clung to Jonathan's coat, it all tugged at memories Mary had buried long ago. After a long silence, Mary approached and sat down beside the girl. "Can I ask you something?" The girl shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "Do you remember your mum?" Mary asked, her voice soft but hesitant. The girl stopped fiddling with the bread, her small fingers tightening around it. She didn't answer straight away. After a pause, she muttered, "Not really." Mary felt a pang in her chest. She leaned in slightly, careful not to push too hard. "What about your dad? Or anyone who looked after you?" The girl lifted her eyes to meet Mary's. Her expression was distant but tinged with sadness. "I don't know. I just remember, she was with me once. But she left me." Mary swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. The pieces were starting to fall into place. She vaguely remembered something from years ago, when a young woman, frightened and desperate, had turned up at the servants' entrance of the Hart mansion. She was holding a small child in her arms, pleading for help. Mary had never learned her name. The woman seemed to be running from something, or someone, but her eyes had held a striking mix of love and fear. Mary remembered how the young mother had asked for a glass of water and how, at the faintest sound from inside the house, she had vanished as swiftly as she'd appeared. At the time, Mary hadn't understood, but now. It all made sense. She glanced at the little girl again, her heart heavy with a growing suspicion. "Do you remember where it happened? Where she left you?" The girl shook her head, but her words confirmed what Mary feared. "I don't know. It was a big place. Pretty. But I wasn't allowed inside." Mary pressed her lips together, a wave of emotions crashing over her. The girl had been there before, at the doorstep of that very house, without anyone knowing. And now, somehow, she had found her way back. Mary knew she couldn't keep this to herself. But for now, she chose not to say anything to the girl. There was too much still to uncover, and it had to be Jonathan who heard it first. Meanwhile, upstairs, the dinner carried on, full of hollow smiles and promises that, to Mary, had never seemed as absurd as they did that night. The dinner followed the predictability of a well-rehearsed opera, yet the air of satisfaction in the room grew heavy, as though everyone sensed the evening was drawing to a close. Clara, ever vigilant, signaled the waitstaff to clear the final plates while keeping lively conversations with the guests. Jonathan, on the other hand, grew increasingly distracted, glancing at his watch from time to time. His thoughts weren't on the dinner, they were downstairs, with Mary and the girl. As one of the guests, a prominent businessman, began to toast the Hart family's generosity, a distant noise shattered the carefully maintained harmony. At first, it was just a faint clatter, like something falling. But soon, raised voices and hurried footsteps followed. Jonathan's eyes snapped up, his senses sharp, but Clara acted quickly, placing a calming hand on his arm. "It must be in the kitchen," she said, glancing toward the corridor. "Probably one of the staff dropped something. Don't worry, darling. I'll handle it." But the noise grew louder, and this time the guests noticed too. Whispers spread around the table as a maid rushed in, her face pale. She approached Clara and murmured something in her ear. Clara's smile faltered briefly but was quickly replaced with her usual composed expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara announced, rising gracefully. "It seems there's been a minor incident in the service area. Nothing to be concerned about. Please, do carry on." Jonathan, however, was already on his feet. He knew Clara too well to believe everything was under control. Without waiting for her protest, he strode across the room and down the corridor to the kitchen. When he arrived, the scene explained the commotion. One of the waiters was on the floor, visibly shaken, with two maids helping him to his feet. Near the back door, two security guards held a disheveled man who was struggling against their grip, his shirt crumpled and fury burning in his eyes. "Who is he?" Jonathan demanded, his voice steady. Mary, standing nearby with the girl clinging to her apron, answered quickly. "He broke in through the back door. Tried to grab food and started shouting when he was caught." Jonathan's gaze moved from the man to Mary, then to the frightened girl clutching her side. There was fear in the child's wide eyes. He turned back to the guards. "Get him out. Make sure he doesn't come back." The guards nodded, dragging the man out through the door. Jonathan scanned the room, taking in the tension. "Is everyone all right?" Mary gave a firm nod. The waiter took a shove, but nothing serious. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "And her?" he asked, tilting his head towards the girl. "Shaken," Mary replied plainly. "But safe." Before they could say more, Clara swept into the kitchen, her expression a careful blend of concern and frustration. "Jonathan, what on earth is going on down here? Why did you leave the guests?" He turned to face her, but before he could answer, Clara's gaze darted towards Mary and, inevitably, to the girl. Her eyes narrowed at once. "What is she doing here? I told you to keep her away from this part of the house." Mary pressed her lips together, remaining silent. Jonathan, however, stepped forward. "Clara, there was a break-in. I was checking what happened. Don't you think that's a bit more important than dinner?" Clara let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Important? Jonathan, you brought a filthy child into our home on the very night we're hosting important guests, and now you're standing here defending it as a priority. It's unacceptable." The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Mary glanced between the two, waiting for the inevitable explosion, while the girl shrank further into her side, clearly uneasy. Jonathan kept his tone steady, but there was an unmistakable firmness in his voice. "Clara, we'll discuss this later. Right now, we need to deal with what happened here." Clara folded her arms, her frustration barely concealed. "Fine. Deal with it. But don't forget where your priorities lie, Jonathan." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to the dining room, her steps brisk and rigid. Jonathan stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he turned back to Mary, he could see she wanted to speak. But he also knew Clara wouldn't let the night end without making another scene. The chaos in the kitchen had been handled, but it was clear the real conflict was only just beginning. With purposeful strides, Jonathan returned to the dining room. As he entered, the hum of conversation faltered for a brief moment before resuming, louder than before. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, some glancing discreetly, others openly curious. The minor incident in the kitchen had clearly stirred the guests' appetite for gossip, though they masked it behind polite expressions of concern. "Jonathan, my dear fellow, what on earth was that?" Lord Spencer was the first to speak, leaning forward with a smile that bordered on mischievous. Sounded a bit more serious than a broken plate. Jonathan forced a smile as he reclaimed his seat, picking up his wine glass and twirling it between his fingers. "Nothing serious, Lord Spencer. Just a little misunderstanding behind the scenes. It's been dealt with." Lady Edith, ever the sharp one, raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" It certainly sounded more dramatic. Clara, already back in her role as the perfect hostess, cut in before Jonathan could answer. "These things happen, Lady Edith. You know how it is, so many staff, so much to coordinate. But as Jonathan said, it's all under control now." The guests murmured their agreement, though it was clear none of them were entirely convinced. Conversations quickly devolved into hushed whispers across the table, each small group speculating on what had really happened. Jonathan noticed the occasional furtive glance in his direction, but he no longer had the energy to keep up appearances. As Clara raised her glass for yet another toast, Jonathan drifted away mentally. He watched the clinking glasses, the exchanged smiles, but it all felt distant, like a play he no longer wished to be part of. When the dessert plates were finally cleared and the dinner officially concluded, Jonathan stood quietly, offering a brief nod to the departing guests. Clara, of course, remained in the room, ensuring everyone received her final smiles and promises of future gatherings. Jonathan slipped out unnoticed, heading down the corridor towards the veranda. As he pushed open the glass doors, a rush of cold air greeted him. The night was clear, the faint moonlight casting a silvery glow over the perfectly manicured gardens. Leaning against the stone balustrade, he closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep, steadying breath. The stillness of the night stood in stark contrast to the turmoil within him. The dinner was over, but the weight of the evening lingered heavily on Jonathan's shoulders. As he gazed out at the horizon, he reflected on everything that had transpired: the girl, the kitchen incident, Clara's reaction, and, more than anything, what it all meant for him. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in thought. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan realized he needed answers, not just about the girl, but about the direction of his own life. The cold night air helped to clear his mind, yet the gravity of the situation refused to lift. He couldn't simply dismiss the girl downstairs or pretend this was a fleeting episode. Her presence in his home had stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't quite define, but that felt too important to ignore. Finally, he decided to check on her. As he walked through the silent corridors of the mansion, he noted the stark contrast between the pristine order of his surroundings and the inner chaos unraveling in his life. When he entered the kitchen, he found Mary seated at the table with the girl wrapped in a blanket. The child seemed less tense now, but still clung to Jonathan's coat like it was a lifeline. Mary glanced up as he walked in and gave a small nod, a silent assurance that things were under control, for now. Jonathan approached and sat beside Mary, his gaze fixed on the girl with a mix of concern and curiosity. He hesitated before asking, "Is she all right?" Mary nodded, though there was something in her expression that suggested more than her words conveyed. "Yes, sir. She's calmer now." But what?" Jonathan leaned in slightly. Mary took a deep breath, glancing at the girl before continuing. "I recognized her, Mr. Hart. I'm almost certain she's been here before." Jonathan frowned, perplexed. "Here? What do you mean?" Mary looked at the girl again, who was absent-mindedly tearing a piece of bread into crumbs on the table. "Years ago, a woman came to the back door. She was desperate, holding a small child in her arms. She asked for help, but she left before we could do anything. It was her, sir. This girl." Jonathan sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. He studied the girl, trying to piece together how this could be possible. Are you sure? Mary nodded firmly. It's her eyes. The way she clutches things, as if she's terrified someone will take them away. I remember it clearly. Before Jonathan could respond, the sharp clatter of heels echoed down the corridor. Moments later, the kitchen door burst open, and Clara swept in like a storm, her face rigid, eyes blazing with fury. "Jonathan! What on earth are you doing in here?" she demanded, ignoring Mary and the girl entirely. "It's bad enough you ruined half the evening with this nonsense, and now you're hiding in the kitchen with that child." Jonathan stood at once, keeping his composure. "Clara, please lower your voice. You're scaring her." "Scaring her?" Clara let out a bitter laugh. "I'm the one who's scared. You brought a street child into our home, Jonathan. Do you have any idea how dangerous and irresponsible that is? Not to mention humiliating." Mary remained silent, though her sharp gaze was locked on Clara, clearly disapproving of her tone. The girl shrank further into the chair, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as if trying to disappear from Clara's imposing presence. "Clara," Jonathan said steadily, his voice firm but measured, "this girl has no one. She needs help. And we can give it to her." "Help?" Clara stepped closer, crossing her arms defensively. "Do you think our home is some sort of shelter? Do you have any idea how this will affect our reputation? What happens tomorrow, Jonathan, when everyone starts asking about tonight?" Jonathan took a deep breath, striving to keep his temper in check. "I don't care what people will say, Clara. This isn't about appearances. It's about doing what's right." "Doing what's right?" Clara shouted, her voice echoing through the kitchen. "What's right is for you to get that child out of this house before she causes any more trouble." Jonathan glanced at the girl, still curled up in her chair, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. He knew Clara wouldn't understand, not tonight, not like this. But for the first time, he wasn't willing to back down. "She's not going anywhere," Jonathan said, his voice low but unwavering. "I'll take care of it." Clara stood in stunned silence for a moment, caught off guard by his tone. But her expression quickly hardened. "Fine. If that's what you want, Jonathan, then go ahead. Do what you like. But don't expect me to be part of it." With a sharp turn, she stormed out, slamming the kitchen door behind her. The heavy silence that followed was almost suffocating, but Jonathan knew the decision had been made. There was no turning back now. Mary gave him a small nod of quiet support. Jonathan looked at the girl again. She clutched the blanket tighter, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric like it was her only source of comfort. "Everything's going to be all right," Jonathan said softly. "I promise." The quiet tension lingered. Long after Clara's departure, Mary glanced at Jonathan, studying the man in front of her as if seeing him in a new light. Then she turned her gaze to the girl, who sat quietly, still clutching Jonathan's coat. The air was thick with unanswered questions, but none of them seemed ready to break the silence. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, letting out a slow, steady breath. "Mary," he said, his tone weary but resolute, "what you said earlier, about her being here before. Are you absolutely sure?" Mary nodded, her voice catching slightly. "I am, sir. That child. I don't know why, but someone brought her here years ago. And if I may say so, there's more to this story than we know." Jonathan frowned, his mind racing. Why would her mother bring her here? What was she looking for? Mary shook her head, her expression distant as memories resurfaced. She seemed desperate. She didn't say much, just asked for water and stood there, staring at the house like she wanted to come inside but couldn't. At the time, I thought she was just another lost soul, someone down on her luck. But now, seeing this girl here, I'm not so sure. Maybe there was a bigger reason. The girl, who had been silent until now, suddenly looked up. Her wide eyes held a mixture of fear and curiosity. "My mum," she murmured, barely audible. Both Jonathan and Mary turned to her, surprised. "What did you say, dear?" Mary asked gently, her voice softening. The girl hesitated, her small frame trembling slightly. But then she spoke again, her voice shaky. "My mum, she talked about a pretty place. A big place. She said I'd be safe there, but I don't know where it was." Jonathan felt the weight of her words like a punch to the chest. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Mary. Both of them knew this wasn't just a case of abandonment. There was a mystery here, something much deeper that needed uncovering. "I can't ignore this," Jonathan said at last, his voice steady. He looked at Mary with determination in his eyes. "I need to find out more. I need to know why she was brought here." Mary nodded slowly. "I'll help you, sir. But tread carefully. Clara's already at her limit, and anything involving this girl will push her further." Jonathan exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. But I can't let that stop me. This girl needs us." He knelt down in front of the child, lowering himself to her eye level. "Listen," he said softly, his voice gentle but sincere. "I don't know exactly what happened to you or your mum, but I'm going to find out. You're safe here now. You don't have to be afraid." The girl didn't answer, but her gaze softened ever so slightly. The fear and distrust were still there, but something in Jonathan's voice seemed to ease her nerves, even if only a little. Jonathan stood up again, turning to Mary. "Take her to the guest room, the small one. Stay with her for now. I don't want her left alone." "Yes, sir," Mary replied, taking the girl's hand gently. As Mary led the girl out of the kitchen, Jonathan leaned against the counter, the weight of the entire night pressing down on him. He knew he was about to step into something complicated, something that could upend his life and his family forever. But deep down, he also knew there was no turning back. That girl's story was now intertwined with his own, and he would do whatever it took to protect her, even if it meant facing the ghosts of the past and the conflicts of the present. Jonathan stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes, turning over everything Mary had revealed and picturing the girl's frightened face. He knew helping her would come with consequences, especially at home, where Clara had already made her stance clear. But there was something in the child's expression, something that echoed in his own conscience, that he simply couldn't ignore. After a deep breath, he decided to head upstairs and check if the girl was comfortable. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint sound of Clara on the phone, probably venting to a friend about the chaos of the night. Jonathan ignored it and kept walking towards the smaller guest room where Mary had taken the girl. When he stepped inside, he saw Mary sitting in a chair near the bed while the girl lay curled up under the blanket, wrapped like a cocoon. A dim light from the bedside lamp cast a soft glow, creating a calm atmosphere. The girl seemed awake but peaceful, her eyes drifting across the ceiling as if lost in thought. Mary stood up when she saw him enter, giving a slight nod. "She's calmer now," she whispered, careful not to disturb the girl. Jonathan looked at the child and felt a quiet relief seeing her in a more settled state. He knelt beside the bed to meet her eye level. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. She looked at him for a moment before murmuring, "It's warm here." A simple response, but enough for Jonathan to sense that, for the first time in a long while, she might actually feel safe. He gave a faint smile. "Good. You deserve that." The girl said nothing more, but her eyes followed him as he stood and turned back to Mary. "She'll stay here tonight," he said. "We can make sure she has a place to sleep, clean clothes, and something to eat until we figure out what to do next." Mary nodded, but there was a trace of concern in her expression. "Mr. Hart, if this child was brought here before, if her mother had something important or urgent to say, perhaps it's time to look into it more closely." Jonathan folded his arms, silently agreeing. "I know. But first, I need to steady things here." Clara's on edge. And rightly so. To her, this was a shock. Mary sighed, but her tone stayed respectful. "With all due respect, sir, sometimes a shock like this is necessary to pull us out of our comfort zone." Jonathan held her gaze for a moment, absorbing her words. Mary had always been straightforward, but she was loyal too, and he trusted her wisdom. "I'll deal with Clara," he said at last. "In the meantime, I want you to keep an eye on the girl. And, if you remember anything else about her mother, let me know immediately." Mary nodded again, and Jonathan left the room, closing the door gently behind him. As he made his way back down the hallway, he felt the weight of the conversation he knew he had to have with Clara. He found her in the living room, clutching a glass of wine tightly, her face still set in irritation. When she saw him, she folded her arms as if bracing for another confrontation. "Well?" Clara began, her voice sharp. "What's your grand plan, Jonathan? Turn our house into a shelter now?" Jonathan exhaled slowly but kept his composure. "Clara, I understand you're upset, but this is different. That girl has no one. And, somehow, she's connected to this house. Don't you think that deserves at least our attention?" Clara gave a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. "Connected to our house? Jonathan, that sounds like an excuse to justify this madness you've dragged into our lives." "It's not madness, Clara," he replied, his tone firmer now. "I don't know why her mother came here all those years ago, but she did." Mary recognized the girl. "There's something bigger happening, something we need to understand." Clara stared at him, shaking her head in disbelief. "And you think the answer is just keeping her here? For how long, Jonathan? Until she causes more trouble? Until someone finds out and it turns into a scandal?" Jonathan clenched his fists, struggling to keep his frustration in check. "Clara, sometimes doing the right thing isn't convenient. And right now, the right thing is making sure that girl is safe." Clara set her wine glass down with a sharp clink, the sound ringing through the room. "You're asking me to accept something that goes against everything we've built. This house, our reputation, our life. Don't you see what you're risking?" Jonathan stepped closer, meeting her gaze directly. "What we're risking, Clara, is our humanity. And to me, that's worth far more than any reputation." The silence that followed was heavy, tension hanging between them like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Clara looked away, picking up her glass again and leaving the room without another word. Jonathan remained there, the weight of their argument pressing down on him. He knew things were far from resolved, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing what was right even if it meant facing conflict within his own home. The tension lingered inside him, but there was a strange sense of certainty he couldn't shake. He knew he'd made the right choice, even if it had shaken the very foundations of his life with Clara. Heading back upstairs, Jonathan decided to check on the guest room again. He needed to be sure Mary and the girl were all right. Gently pushing the door open, he found Mary still sitting in the same chair, while the girl slept soundly in the bed, still clutching the coat he had given her. Mary looked up as he entered, her face a mixture of exhaustion and quiet concern. Jonathan approached silently, watching the girl for a few moments before turning back to Mary. "She seems more settled now," he whispered. "Yes," Mary replied softly. She fell asleep quickly, like she finally felt safe. But Jonathan frowned. "But what?" Mary hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, I've been thinking about something that might be important. The woman who brought this girl here years ago, she seemed desperate, but also like she was running from something. I remember seeing marks on her arms, like she'd been hurt. And the way she looked at this house, at you and your family, made me think there was more to her story." Jonathan absorbed Mary's words, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "You think she was connected to me somehow? That maybe she knew our family?" Mary gave a small shrug. "It's hard to say. But if that woman brought the girl here back then, and now she's returned so suddenly, there might be something we're not seeing. Maybe she believed this house was the only safe place for the child." Jonathan stood in thoughtful silence, his eyes drifting back to the girl's peaceful face. The idea that she could be connected to his family in some way unsettled him deeply. What if Mary was right? What if the woman had known something about him, or even Clara, that explained why she'd chosen this place? "There's someone I can speak to," Jonathan finally said quietly, turning back to Mary with a determined expression. "An old friend in the police. He can help me find out more about her mother or whatever happened back then." Mary nodded, relief softening her features. "That makes sense. But, Mr. Hart," she paused, her face growing serious again. "Clara's reaching a breaking point. I don't know how long she'll accept having this girl here. Not without a fight." Jonathan drew a deep breath, folding his arms. "I know. But Clara will have to understand. I'm not sending that child away. Not while there's something I can do for her." Mary didn't respond immediately, but her gaze held a mix of respect and concern. She knew Jonathan was determined, yet she also knew Clara wouldn't give in so easily. "Look after her tonight," Jonathan said, nodding towards the girl. "And tomorrow? I'll start looking for answers." Mary gave a silent nod, and Jonathan left the room, closing the door carefully behind him. As he walked down the quiet hallway, his mind was crowded with unanswered questions. Who was the woman who had brought the girl here? Why had she chosen his home? And what did it mean for the future? When he reached his bedroom, he found Clara already in bed, her back turned towards the door. He knew there was no point trying to speak to her that night. Instead, he lay on the opposite side of the bed, staring at the ceiling. As the silence of the night settled over the house, Jonathan felt something shift within him, a growing determination to uncover the truth. He didn't know what he would find, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Jonathan was already up. He left the house early, careful not to wake Clara, and drove straight to the police station where his old friend, Inspector Lewis, worked. Lewis was a pragmatic man, well seasoned in dealing with messy situations and difficult people. "Jonathan Hart," Lewis said, glancing up as Jonathan entered his office. "What brings someone like you here? Trouble with business deals?" Jonathan shook his head and lowered himself into the chair across from Lewis's desk. "No, Lewis. This isn't about business. It's about a child." Lewis raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, and leaned forward. "I'm listening." Jonathan recounted the entire story, from how he had found the girl to what Mary had revealed about the woman who had appeared years earlier. When he finished, Lewis's expression had grown serious, his face lined with thought. "This isn't a common situation, Jonathan," Lewis said, folding his arms. "But I can run some checks. If this woman was on the run, there might be traces, police reports, hospital records, something. I'll see what I can dig up." Jonathan nodded, feeling a glimmer of relief. "Thank you, Lewis. Anything you can find could be vital." "Don't worry," the inspector replied. "But I'll warn you now, Jonathan, sometimes when you start pulling at threads, you uncover things you might wish you hadn't. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Jonathan met Lewis's gaze, his expression unwavering. "I'm sure. I need to know the truth." Lewis gave a small nod and reached for some paperwork. As he began filling out forms to initiate the search, Jonathan felt as though he had taken the first real step toward finding the answers he'd been seeking. But he also knew he was stepping into unknown territory, where the truth could be harder to face than he expected. While Jonathan waited in Lewis's office, watching the inspector fill out forms and make notes, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced down, seeing his personal assistant Emily's name on the screen. Jonathan exhaled sharply. Whatever it was, he knew it wasn't something he wanted to deal with right now. He answered with a professional but curt tone. "Emily. Mr. Hart, sorry to bother you so early, but we've got a serious issue at the main office." Emily's voice was tight, urgent. "The lead investor in the Asian project has just pulled out. We need you to step in, or the entire timeline could collapse." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of it pressing down. He knew how critical the Asian project was for the company, yet his mind was far from corporate matters now. His focus was on the girl and the mystery unfolding around her. "Emily," he said, keeping his voice steady, "send me a full report by email. I'll deal with it as soon as I can, but I won't be in the office this morning." "Mr. Hart," she pressed, a note of tension rising, "I'm not sure this can wait. We're talking about millions on the line." Jonathan's jaw tightened. She was right, but every passing moment felt like it was dragging him further from the truth he was determined to uncover. After a brief pause, he finally replied, "Tell the team I trust them to keep things steady until I get there. I won't be long." Emily didn't sound entirely convinced, but relented. "Very well, sir. I'll update you shortly." Jonathan ended the call, placing his phone on the desk with more force than intended. Lewis glanced up from his paperwork, curious. "Trouble at work?" "The usual," Jonathan replied with a tired smile. "But nothing that needs my attention right this second. This is the priority now." Lewis nodded. "Got it. I'll start digging today." "But, Jonathan, if this woman was running, people like that don't leave much of a trail unless things got extreme. It might take some time. I'll need your patience." Jonathan shook his friend's hand, grateful for his help, then left the station, his mind crowded with loose ends. As he drove back home, the same question circled relentlessly. Who was the girl's mother? Why had she brought her to this house, of all places? When he pulled up to the mansion, Jonathan noticed Clara outside in the garden, chatting with a friend over tea. Her expression was composed as always, but he knew beneath the polished exterior, a storm was brewing. Not yet, he thought. He wasn't ready for that confrontation. Jonathan entered through the side door and headed straight upstairs to check on the girl. As he eased the guest room door open, he found Mary sitting on the edge of the bed, speaking softly to the child, who still seemed drowsy but noticeably calmer than the night before. "How is she?" Jonathan asked in a hushed tone. Mary glanced up at him, then back at the girl. "Better. She ate a little this morning. Still not saying much, but I think she's starting to feel a bit safer." Jonathan moved closer, kneeling beside the bed again. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. The girl shrugged but murmured just loud enough for him to catch. "Better." Jonathan offered a small smile. "That's good. Listen, I'm going to try to find out more about your mum, all right? I'll do everything I can to help." The girl watched him with wide, cautious eyes but stayed silent. Trust wouldn't come easily, Jonathan knew that. He stood and gestured for Mary to follow him into the hallway. Once outside, Mary's face shifted into a more serious expression. "And now, sir? Any word from your friend at the station?" Jonathan nodded. "Lewis will start looking into it today. It could take a while, but I trust him to find something. In the meantime, we need to keep things calm here. Clara's still furious, and I won't have her taking it out on the girl." Mary sighed, though she nodded in agreement. "Understood. I'll keep the little one busy, and away from any tension." Jonathan offered a grateful nod before heading back downstairs. He knew he couldn't ignore the issues at work forever, yet he felt torn, balancing two worlds, one of corporate obligations and the other pulling him toward a deeper, more personal fight. As he adjusted his watch, ready to leave again, he heard brisk footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Clara standing in the hallway, arms folded tightly, her expression cold and unyielding. "You're leaving again?" she demanded, the accusation clear in her voice. "Yes," Jonathan replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I have something to handle at work." Clara's eyes narrowed. "I hope, at least there, you're getting your priorities straight. Because here, Jonathan, things are completely out of control." He drew a deep breath, patience wearing thin. "Clara, I told you, I'll handle this. But not right now. I have to go." Without waiting for her response, Jonathan turned and left the mansion, the heavy tension lingering behind him. He knew he was leaving too many loose ends, at work, at home, and in the search for answers. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered, even if it meant defying the expectations that had always surrounded him. As Jonathan entered the headquarters of his company, he immediately felt the shift in pace. The air was thick with the usual urgency of corporate life, but today it felt even more intense. Staff moved briskly through the glass corridors, phones in hand, exchanging hurried, tense whispers. Adjusting his suit, Jonathan prepared to dive back into a world of negotiations and numbers, though his mind was miles away. On reaching the executive floor, he was met by Emily, his assistant, who approached him with a folder in hand and a concerned expression. "Mr. Hart, the team is gathered in the conference room. All the details about the investor pulling out are in here," she said, handing him the folder as she walked alongside him. Just before entering the conference room, Jonathan noticed a woman standing by one of the windows in the hallway. She didn't quite blend into the impersonal, high-pressure atmosphere of the office. She wore a simple wool coat and had a calm but observant demeanor, as though she were quietly absorbing every detail around her. Their eyes met briefly as Jonathan passed. "Is she new?" Jonathan asked, glancing at Emily. Emily hesitated, as if trying to recall. "Oh, yes. That's Grace Miller. She's one of the external consultants brought in by the strategy team. They say she's quite efficient." Jonathan nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about Grace. She didn't seem hurried or anxious like the others, and her almost relaxed posture stood out against the tense energy of the office. He considered asking more but decided it wasn't the time. Grace, meanwhile, watched as Jonathan disappeared into the conference room, a faint, enigmatic smile playing on her lips, as though she already knew something he didn't. Inside the conference room, Jonathan was met with the chaos he had anticipated. Team members were clustered around a long table, laptops open, voices overlapping in heated discussions. As soon as he entered, the room fell silent and all eyes turned to him. Mr. Hart, one of the project managers, began, standing to hand him a report. "As you're aware, we lost the lead investor for the Asian project this morning. We're trying to renegotiate, but there's mounting pressure to secure alternative deals on a very tight timeline." Jonathan took the report and began skimming through it, listening intently as the managers laid out the details. Despite the critical nature of the situation, he remained composed, carefully analyzing each point. After a few moments, he looked up and said, "We need to restructure our priorities. I want a list of potential investors we can approach immediately. Assess the feasibility of adjusting the costs to make the project more appealing. As for the investor who pulled out, arrange a direct meeting with me. There might still be room for negotiation." The team nodded quickly, jotting down his instructions. Jonathan knew the problem was significant, but also knew it was the sort of challenge he'd tackled countless times before. What truly unsettled him was the growing distraction he felt, as though part of his focus was being pulled away from the room and towards something far beyond it. As the meeting continued, the image of Grace Miller briefly crossed his mind again. There was something about her that felt out of place, almost as if she belonged to an entirely different world from the one he occupied every day. But Jonathan shook his head, pushing the thought aside. He needed to be present in the moment. He would deal with whatever was needed at the office, but he knew that as soon as he left, his attention would shift back to the other pressing matter in his life, the girl and the mystery surrounding her. For the next hour, Jonathan remained focused, listening to reports, refining strategies, and delegating tasks. Despite the apparent chaos, his team was capable, and he trusted that they could turn the situation around with time and focus. He reviewed the key points, ensured everyone understood the priorities, and wrapped up the meeting with a tone that was firm but encouraging. "We know what needs to be done," Jonathan said as he stood. "You have my full support, but we need to move quickly. Any progress, no matter how small, I want to know immediately." The managers nodded, scattering quickly to implement the new directives. Jonathan, however, stayed behind for a moment, standing by the large window that overlooked London's towering skyline. This world was familiar to him, the constant pressure of making decisions that impacted millions, but, for the first time, it felt distant, almost insignificant. His mind drifted back to the girl. Her expression, the way she shrank as if hoping to disappear, remained etched in his thoughts. What he was facing at home was something no corporate strategy could fix. It was raw, human, something that challenged him in a way he wasn't used to. As he left the conference room, Jonathan walked down the corridor with his usual confident stride but slowed as he spotted Grace Miller again. She was sitting in a small break area, flipping through a folder with a calm focus. This time, he stopped. "Excuse me, Grace, isn't it?" he asked as he approached. She looked up, a faint smile curving her lips. "Yes, Mr. Hart. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Jonathan noted the formality of her words, but her tone was surprisingly casual, almost conversational. "Well, welcome to the team. Emily mentioned you're helping with some of our urgent projects." Grace closed the folder and folded her hands over it, her smile never wavering. "That's right. I mostly work on strategic crises, or situations that need a fresh perspective." Jonathan nodded, intrigued by her choice of words. "And what do you make of our situation so far?" Grace tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her response. "It's a complex challenge, but not unsolvable. Sometimes, the hardest part isn't finding the solution, it's convincing the right people to accept it." Jonathan couldn't help but smile faintly. There was something sharp in the way she spoke, as though every word was chosen to land precisely where it needed to. He nodded in agreement. "That's a lesson I've learned more times than I can count." Grace studied him for a moment, as if she were trying to unravel something. "You seem like someone with plenty of lessons learned, Mr. Hart. But may I ask something? Just an observation, really." Jonathan raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead." "You don't seem entirely here," Grace said, her tone curious rather than accusatory. "If you don't mind me saying, it's like there's something outside this office that's pulling more of your focus than any business crisis could." Jonathan paused, surprised. It wasn't often that someone spoke to him so directly, with such genuine curiosity. He prepared to give a vague response, but for some reason, he chose to be honest. "You're right," he admitted with a small sigh. "There's something personal going on. But it's not something that can be solved in a meeting." Grace nodded, not pushing further. "Well, Mr. Hart, personal crises are often the ones that test us the most. And, in my experience, the best solutions tend to show up when we least expect them." Jonathan offered a slight nod of thanks, finding her words oddly comforting. She didn't know anything about his situation, yet her understanding tone felt grounding, as if she recognized the weight he was carrying without needing details. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Grace," he said before heading off. As he made his way to the exit, Jonathan felt that the brief interaction had left an impression on him, a reminder that, even in the midst of chaos, there was room for different perspectives. He stepped into the lift and descended to the car park, ready to return to the mansion. There was still so much to do, and his priority remained clear: uncover the truth about the girl and protect her, no matter the cost. As he drove through London's streets, he mentally prepared himself for what lay ahead. There were many pieces still to fall into place, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, even if the road ahead was uncertain. Jonathan was still on his way home when Mary, sitting in her small room at the back of the mansion, began piecing together the puzzle that had haunted her since she recognized the girl. Seated in her wooden chair, she held an old keepsake box she kept hidden in her wardrobe. Inside were small items she'd collected over the years: letters, faded photographs, fragments of a past she rarely revisited. As she sifted through the photos, her fingers stopped on a particular image. It was a faded picture of a group of the mansion staff taken years ago. At the center of the photo stood a young woman with large, nervous eyes. Her long, brown hair framed her face, and there was something familiar about the way she held her hands, almost as though she were trying to protect herself. Mary pulled the photo closer, her heart racing. That woman was the girl's mother, of that, she was now certain. But it was more than that. The woman wasn't a stranger, she had worked here, in the Hart mansion. Mary took a deep breath, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her. It can't be, she murmured to herself, pulling out a few more letters from the box. Among them, she found a small handwritten note in hurried script. Mary, thank you for everything. I can't stay. They wouldn't understand. Take care. Evelyn, Evelyn. The name came flooding back to her. Evelyn had been a young maid who worked in the house years ago. She was shy but diligent and had always seemed out of place among the other staff. Evelyn had come from difficult circumstances, but she worked hard and with quiet determination. Still, there was always something about her, a sense of unease, as though she were constantly looking over her shoulder. Mary also remembered the day Evelyn had vanished without warning, leaving behind no explanation. At the time, everyone assumed she'd either buckled under the pressure or found another opportunity elsewhere. But now, with the girl's arrival, everything was beginning to make sense. Evelyn had left the mansion carrying a secret. And that secret was the girl. Mary froze for a moment, clutching the photograph and note in her hands. She knew this was important, something Jonathan needed to know. But she also realized that this revelation could have unpredictable consequences, especially if Clara found out. Standing abruptly, Mary slipped the photo and note into her apron pocket and left her room, heading straight for the main floor. She had to speak to Jonathan before anything else. But as she hurried down the corridor towards his study, she nearly collided with Clara, who was on the phone. Clara ended the call and fixed Mary with a suspicious look, noticing her flustered state. Mary, Clara began, crossing her arms, what's going on? You've been acting strangely ever since that child arrived. Is there something I should know? Mary hesitated, feeling the weight of the confrontation looming. She knew she couldn't simply tell Clara the truth, not yet, at least. But the sharpness in Clara's gaze made it clear she wouldn't accept vague answers. I've been looking into some things, Mary replied, keeping her tone respectful. But I don't think this is the right time to discuss it. Clara narrowed her eyes. You don't think? Mary, this is my house, and I have every right to know what's happening. That child has already caused enough trouble. I won't tolerate any more secrets. Mary took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. I understand. But I believe Mr. Hart should be present for this conversation. Clara let out a bitter laugh. Oh, of course, Jonathan. It's always Jonathan, isn't it? It seems everyone in this house is more interested in pleasing him than maintaining order. Fine, Mary. You can tell him I'm waiting for answers. And I won't accept any more excuses. With that, Clara stormed off, leaving Mary standing in the corridor. Mary's heart pounded, but she knew she couldn't stop now. She had to speak to Jonathan before Clara interfered again. Meanwhile, Jonathan had just pulled into the mansion's driveway, completely unaware of the revelation waiting for him. As he stepped inside, he could feel the heavy tension lingering in the air, a tension that had refused to dissipate since the girl's arrival. Mary spotted Jonathan the moment he entered and hurried towards him, clutching her apron tightly. Mr. Hart, I need to speak with you. It's important. Jonathan noticed the urgency in her tone and nodded, guiding her to the study for privacy. Once the door was closed, Mary pulled a photograph and a handwritten note from her pocket, placing them carefully on the desk in front of him. Sir, she began softly, this is the girl's mother. Jonathan picked up the photo and note, studying them with furrowed brows. She worked here? Yes, Mary confirmed, sitting across from him. Her name was Evelyn. She was a maid here years ago, but she left suddenly. Now I'm certain she left because she was pregnant and thought no one here would accept it. Jonathan remained silent, processing the information. The realization that the girl had such a close connection to the mansion, and, by extension, to him and Clara, left him momentarily stunned. If Evelyn brought the girl here, he finally said, then she believed this was the only place where she'd be safe. We need to find out what happened to Evelyn, and why she felt she had to run. Mary nodded. Yes, sir. But there's more. I think Mrs. Hart will react very badly to this, especially if she thinks this story could damage us in any way. Jonathan narrowed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew he had to address Clara eventually, but uncovering the truth had to take priority, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. He looked again at Evelyn's photograph, sensing that this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. Jonathan stared at the photo for a long moment. Evelyn, standing among the other mansion staff, wore a serene expression, but there was something in her eyes, even in the faded image, that hinted at a story no one knew. The note, scrawled hastily, only deepened the enigma. Evelyn, Jonathan murmured to himself. She brought the girl here, because she believed she'd be safe. But safe from what? Mary, seated before him, looked just as uneasy. Sir, Evelyn was always very private. She didn't speak much about her life before coming here, but there were times when she seemed afraid. I don't know why, but it was as if she was always looking over her shoulder. Jonathan pressed his lips together, trying to connect the dots. If she was running, it might have been from someone. A partner, maybe? Or trouble with her family. We need to find out more about her. Mary hesitated, then spoke again. I can try reaching out to some of the old staff, sir. Maybe someone remembers something more about her. Jonathan nodded, appreciating her initiative. Do that. Any detail could be important. Before they could plan their next steps, the study door swung open with a loud bang, revealing Clara standing in the doorway. Her face was rigid, her eyes blazing with restrained fury. Jonathan, she said, her voice icy, how much longer do you plan on excluding me from these investigations you're conducting in my own home? Jonathan rose to his feet, swiftly placing the photograph and note on the desk but partially covering them with a report to keep them out of Clara's immediate view. Clara, this isn't something you want to discuss right now. Oh, I completely disagree, Clara retorted, folding her arms tightly. I demand to know what's going on. Ever since that girl arrived, you've been acting as if I'm a stranger in my own house. This is my home, Jonathan. And I have every right to know what you and Mary are plotting. Mary, who usually stayed quiet during such confrontations, stood up, trying to defuse the situation. Mrs. Hart, we're not plotting anything. We're simply trying to understand the girl's situation better. Oh, of course, Clara shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Because understanding the situation of some dirty, unknown child is clearly more important than dealing with our family, our work, and everything that actually matters. Jonathan raised a hand, cutting her off. That's enough, Clara. This isn't just any situation. That girl isn't a stranger. She's connected to this house, and I believe she deserves our attention. Clara let out a bitter laugh. Connected? How, Jonathan? Don't tell me she's some long-lost relative. This is getting ridiculous. Before he could respond, Clara stepped forward, noticing the photograph on the desk. With a sharp motion, she snatched it up, her eyes narrowing as they scanned the image. "Evelyn," she murmured, immediately recognizing the woman in the picture. Jonathan and Mary exchanged tense glances as Clara held the photo, her expression shifting from surprise to something colder, more calculating. "I remember her," Clara continued, her voice edged with disdain. "She was quiet. Yes, I remember when she suddenly disappeared without a word. And now you're telling me this girl is her daughter?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "That's what it looks like." Clara set the photo back down with a loud thud, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. "And why does that matter, Jonathan?" "Because, to me, it just makes this situation even messier. If Evelyn had problems, they are not our responsibility. Not then, not now." Jonathan took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. "Clara, that girl was brought here because Evelyn believed this was the only place safe for her. That can't be a coincidence. We can't just turn our backs on that." Clara stared at him, her eyes narrowing further. "And what exactly do you suggest, Jonathan? That we turn our home into some sanctuary for the past? That we ruin everything we've built for someone who doesn't even belong here?" Jonathan exhaled slowly, struggling to keep his temper in check. "What I'm suggesting, Clara, is that we think beyond ourselves for once. That girl needs help. And I'm going to give it to her, with or without your support." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with tension, the weight of long-buried frustrations pressing down on both of them. At last, Clara turned on her heel, heading for the door but pausing just before leaving. "If you insist on this, Jonathan, don't expect me to be part of it. I've done enough holding this house together while you chase these hero fantasies." She stormed out, the door slamming behind her, leaving Jonathan and Mary alone once again. The silence she left behind was heavy, but Jonathan knew, this time, he wouldn't back down. Mary, cautious as ever, broke the quiet. "Sir, what do we do now?" Jonathan picked up the photograph again, staring hard at Evelyn's face. "Now," he said with quiet determination, "we find out exactly what happened to her, and why she thought this was the only place her daughter could be safe." He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but there was no turning back. Something much bigger was unfolding, and he was ready to face it, whatever it took to protect that girl and uncover the truth. Jonathan sat in the stillness of his study after Clara had gone, the echo of her words lingering in the air. He knew her resistance wasn't the only obstacle. The mystery surrounding Evelyn, her sudden disappearance and the reason she'd brought her daughter to their home, demanded answers, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. Turning to Mary, he held the photograph tightly. "I need to take this to Lewis. If anyone can help track down what happened to Evelyn, it's him." Mary nodded, though concern clouded her expression. "Sir, if Clara finds out you're going this far, it could make things worse between you." Jonathan drew a deep breath. "I know, Mary. But this is bigger than Clara, or me. It's about doing the right thing." Not long after, he was back behind the wheel, driving towards the police station where his friend Inspector Lewis was already waiting. The office was modest, a clutter of files and worn desks. Lewis greeted him with a firm handshake, gesturing to a growing pile of documents on his desk. "Jonathan," Lewis said, his voice grim. "I've started digging, but I'm not sure you'll like what I've found so far." Jonathan handed over the photo. "This is the girl's mother. Her name's Evelyn. She worked at my house years ago, then vanished. I need to know what happened, where she went, who she was involved with, anything that could explain why she brought her daughter back to my home." Lewis studied the photo closely, nodding thoughtfully. I'll run it through the system, see if we get any hits. But Jonathan, from what I've found so far, this doesn't look like someone who just left quietly. If she disappeared, it was because she was running from something serious. She was hiding. Jonathan frowned. Hiding from what, exactly? Lewis hesitated before answering. I'm not certain yet, but there are some hospital records under her name from shortly after she left your house. The injuries she was treated for, they're consistent with physical assault. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. She was in danger. Yes, Lewis replied, flipping through the report. And if you're right about her connection to your home, there's probably more to this. I'll check domestic violence records and other local reports. But, Jonathan, this could lead somewhere messy. Jonathan nodded, already bracing himself. Do whatever you have to, Lewis. I just need the truth. On the drive back home, Jonathan's thoughts raced. Evelyn had been running from something, or someone, dangerous. And her link to the house suggested she'd believed it was the only safe place for her daughter. But why? And where was she now? When he arrived back at the mansion, he found Mary in the kitchen with the girl, who seemed more at ease than before. She was holding a small notepad, scribbling simple drawings. As Jonathan stepped in, the girl glanced up at him, still watching him with that guarded, uncertain look. Jonathan approached gently. Hey, he said softly. How you feeling? Okay, she replied, her voice quiet but less fearful. He glanced at the drawing. Is that you? He asked, pointing to the figure she was sketching. The girl nodded. It was a simple image, a small figure holding the hand of a taller woman. Jonathan realized it was Evelyn. She was really good to you, wasn't she? He asked, trying to reach her. The girl nodded again, staring at the paper with a faraway look in her eyes. Yeah, but she said I had to stay here. That this was the only place I'd be safe. Jonathan felt the weight of her words. Evelyn had placed her trust, her daughter's safety, in this house, in him, even though he'd never understood it at the time. Now, he knew he couldn't fail that trust, even if it had come too late. Mary approached, lowering her voice. Mr. Hart, did something else happen? Jonathan shook his head. Not yet. Lewis is still digging, but Evelyn was running from something dangerous. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Mary nodded, though worry lingered in her expression. Mrs. Hart, she's still not happy. And I'm certain she's planning something. Jonathan exhaled slowly, knowing Mary was right. Clara wouldn't let the girl's presence go unchallenged for long. He had to uncover the truth before Clara's frustration boiled over into something drastic. Deep down, Jonathan knew that whatever had happened with Evelyn held the key to protecting the girl, and perhaps even understanding something about himself he'd long avoided facing. Time was slipping away, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He would do whatever it took to find answers and keep the girl safe, no matter the cost. Tension in the house was reaching its breaking point. Clara barely spoke to him, and Mary's quiet updates on her watchful glare toward the girl only added to Jonathan's unease. He felt as though he was circling the heart of the mystery, yet with each step closer, the threat of explosive consequences grew stronger. The following morning, Jonathan's phone buzzed, and the tension sharpened as he answered. Lewis's voice was grave. Jonathan, I've got more information, he said. Evelyn was running from a man. A name kept coming up in the records, a Thomas Avery. Violent history, tied to her for a while. The key detail? He tried to track her down just months before she vanished completely. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. Thomas Avery? Who is he? A failed businessman, but with a dark past. Connections to some dangerous people, financially and personally. My guess? Evelyn was trying to escape something connected to him, or someone backing him. Jonathan stood in silence for a moment. The mention of a dangerous man like Avery shifted everything. Evelyn hadn't just run to save herself, she had risked everything to keep her daughter safe from someone who was clearly a real threat. Do you think he could still be looking for her? Jonathan finally asked. Lewis exhaled slowly. It's possible. Men like him, they don't give up easily. Jonathan thanked him for the information and ended the call, the name Thomas Avery lingering like a dark shadow in his mind. He had never heard of the man before, but the danger he represented felt all too real. Now, Jonathan knew he had to protect the girl, no matter the cost. And yet, he also had to brace himself for the inevitable confrontation with Clara, whose hostility was only growing stronger. That evening, when Jonathan returned home, he found Clara waiting for him in the sitting room, a glass of wine in hand, her expression cold and unyielding. Jonathan, she began sharply, skipping any pleasantries, this ends now. I won't tolerate this situation any longer. That girl needs to leave. Jonathan stopped in the doorway, his jaw tightening. Clara, I'm not sending her away. She's here for a reason, and you know it. Clara set her glass down with a deliberate clink, the sound cutting through the room. What I know is that you're tearing our lives apart over a child who doesn't belong here. Do you really think you're going to save the world, Jonathan? That you're some kind of hero? Jonathan inhaled deeply, fighting to keep his composure. This isn't about being a hero. It's about doing what's right. Evelyn trusted this house as the only safe place for her daughter. I won't betray that trust. Clara let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You're willing to throw away everything, our marriage, our reputation, for this? For someone who isn't even here anymore to thank you for your self-righteousness? Jonathan met her gaze, his voice low but unwavering. Yes, Clara. Because right now, that little girl matters more than any reputation you're so desperate to protect. The silence between them felt heavier than ever. Clara's eyes narrowed, a storm of anger and pain behind them, but she said nothing more. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Jonathan standing there alone. He didn't hesitate. Heading straight upstairs, he found Mary sitting beside the girl, who was quietly playing with a small toy Mary had dug out from an old storage box. The child looked calmer, though still guarded, her little fingers carefully tracing patterns on the warm toy. Jonathan leaned closer and quietly explained to Mary what Lewis had discovered. Her face darkened with concern. Thomas Avery, she murmured. That name. I've heard it before. Years ago. There were whispers, money, scandals. If Evelyn was running from him, the danger is greater than we thought. Jonathan nodded grimly. We need to act quickly. He can't find her here. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the mansion's doorbell echoed through the house, cutting through the tense quiet. Jonathan and Mary exchanged a glance, both instantly alert. Jonathan was the first to move, making his way downstairs with purpose. As he opened the heavy front door, his heart sank. A tall man stood on the doorstep, his expression hard, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't belong in the elegance of the house. There was something too sharp, too dangerous about his presence. His clothes were neat but unremarkable, yet his posture screamed quiet menace. "Good evening," the man said, voice calm but firm. "I'm Thomas Avery. I'm looking for someone." Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his chest but kept his face unreadable. "Thomas Avery," he repeated evenly. "What exactly do you want here?" Avery's lips curled into a smile, but it never reached his eyes. "I'm looking for someone I believe is under your care. A little girl. Curly hair, small. I'm a friend of her mother's." Jonathan folded his arms, holding Avery's gaze. "Evelyn," he said, testing the man's reaction. Avery didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, but the forced smile faded. "Yes, Evelyn. She was close to me. But she made some poor choices. I'm here to set things right." Jonathan didn't break eye contact, though every instinct told him this was no simple visit. Avery wasn't just someone from Evelyn's past, he was the danger she had run from. And now he was standing here, demanding something Jonathan would never give up. "Evelyn isn't here anymore," Jonathan replied evenly. "And honestly, I don't see how this has anything to do with me, or this house." Avery took a single step forward, close enough for Jonathan to sense the tension coiling beneath his calm facade. "Mr. Hart, you're not a fool. I know her daughter's here. I know Evelyn left her with you, or someone under your roof. I'm only here to collect what's mine." Jonathan felt the anger rise, his voice steady but sharper now. "Yours?" he repeated, his stare hardening. "Evelyn brought her daughter here to protect her from you, Avery. She knew this was the only safe place. That makes you the threat." For a moment, something flickered in Avery's eyes, not surprise, but recognition. He understood, now, that Jonathan wouldn't be easily intimidated. "You don't understand," Avery said, his voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "Evelyn took something from me. And I don't intend to let it go." Jonathan stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his voice ice cold. "What Evelyn took from you was the chance to hurt someone else. You won't get near that girl. Not here. Not while I'm standing in this house." Avery didn't move, his gaze locked on Jonathan's as though weighing his next move. Finally, he took a slow step back, raising his hands in a mock gesture of peace. "Understood, Mr. Hart," he said, his smile tight, calculated. "But people have a way of changing their minds under pressure. I'm a patient man." He turned slowly, descending the front steps with deliberate calm, yet the threat in his words lingered long after he disappeared through the gates. Jonathan closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Mary appeared in the hallway, her face pale, eyes wide. "Who was that?" "Thomas Avery," Jonathan answered, voice steady but tense. "He knows she's here. And now, Mary, we have to protect that girl, whatever it takes." Mary nodded, but there was fear in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" Jonathan clenched his fists, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his chest. "First, I'm calling Lewis. If Avery's come this far, he won't stop. But he won't get near her. Not in this house." He took the stairs two at a time, reaching the guest room where the girl sat on the bed, clutching his coat tightly to her chest. Her wide eyes met his, filled with silent questions he couldn't yet answer. "It's all right," Jonathan whispered, kneeling before her. "I promise you're safe here." But even as he said the words, he knew the storm was only just beginning. The confrontation with Avery wasn't the end, it was the start of something far greater. And Jonathan was prepared to face it all if it meant keeping that child safe from the shadows of Evelyn's past. Jonathan spent the rest of the night pacing, planning, the mansion heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Avery wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. His presence lingered like a shadow stretching through the house, an unspoken threat pressing closer. As he moved towards the guest room again, Jonathan felt the burden grow heavier. This wasn't just about protecting the girl. It was about giving her a future untouched by the dangers Evelyn had fought so hard to escape. When he opened the door, Mary was sitting beside the bed, holding the girl's hand gently. Though clearly trying to stay calm, tension was written across her face. The girl looked up at Jonathan, those same wide, hopeful eyes searching his face for reassurance. "Jonathan," Mary whispered, rising from her chair, "we can't wait any longer. We need to do something. Now." He nodded, moving closer to the bed. "I've already told Lewis. He's gathering information and will do his best to keep Avery in check. But it might not be enough." Mary watched him closely, noting the determination in his eyes. "What are you going to do?" Jonathan took a deep breath, crouching down to the girl's level. He gently took her hands in his. "Listen," he said softly, "I promised you'd be safe here, and I intend to keep that promise. But I need you to trust me." The girl nodded slowly, though she was still visibly nervous. "Mary," Jonathan said, turning to the housekeeper, "get everything she needs ready. We're taking her somewhere Avery won't be able to reach her." Mary looked surprised, but quickly nodded. "Yes, sir." "But what about Mrs. Hart?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment. "Clara will have to understand. I'm not putting this girl's safety at risk for the sake of appearances." As Mary began gathering the girl's belongings, Jonathan left the room and called Lewis. "Lewis," he said the moment his friend answered, "I need a favor. A safe place, off the grid. Somewhere Avery won't be able to track." Lewis sighed on the other end of the line. "Jonathan, you're walking into dangerous territory. But I've got a few contacts. A private shelter, out of town. It's discreet, no one asks questions." "Perfect," Jonathan replied. "Send me the address. I'll take her there myself." As Jonathan hung up, Clara appeared in the hallway, her face a mask of frustration. "Jonathan, what's going on now?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I saw Mary packing. Are you seriously taking that girl somewhere?" Jonathan stared at her, his patience finally snapping. "Yes, Clara. I am. Avery was here today. He wants to take her, and I won't let that happen. If you can't understand that, maybe you need to reconsider what really matters to you." Clara was silent for a moment, surprised by his firm tone. Instead of arguing further, she turned and walked away without another word, her silence saying more than anything she could have said. Not long after, Jonathan, Mary, and the girl were ready to leave. Jonathan carried the girl's small bag while she clung tightly to Mary's hand, reluctant to let go. Before they got into the car, Jonathan crouched down in front of her again. "Do you trust me?" he asked, looking straight into her eyes. The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded, gripping his hand tighter. "Everything's going to be all right," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. As they drove along the empty road towards the shelter Lewis had mentioned, Jonathan felt the tension mounting with every mile. The silence in the car was heavy, but the girl's presence beside him gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, closing in fast. Jonathan frowned, adjusting the mirror for a better look. The car behind was speeding up, flashing its lights in a clear act of intimidation. "Hold on," he said, his tone low and serious. Avery's car caught up, forcing Jonathan to swerve to the side of the road. Mary held the girl tightly as Jonathan fought to keep control of the vehicle. Avery didn't let up, trying to push Jonathan's car off the road. Jonathan knew he had to act fast. He slammed on the brakes, causing Avery's car to speed past. Taking advantage of the maneuver, Jonathan turned onto a dirt road leading to the shelter, accelerating as much as the rough terrain allowed. Avery tried to follow, but the uneven ground made the pursuit more difficult. Finally, the shelter came into view, a secluded house surrounded by dense trees. Jonathan brought the car to a stop, quickly helping Mary and the girl out. Lewis was already there, waiting at the entrance. "Get inside, quickly," he urged, holding the door open. Jonathan carried the girl inside, a mix of relief and adrenaline coursing through him. As Lewis locked the door behind them, he turned to Jonathan, his expression serious. "You've managed to keep him away for now. But this isn't over, Jonathan." Jonathan glanced at the girl, now safe in Mary's arms. He knew Lewis was right. Avery remained a threat, but at least for the moment, the girl was out of harm's way. Kneeling before her once more, he gently took her small hands. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way." The girl looked at him, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on her face. It was a glimmer of hope, and Jonathan knew every risk had been worth it. As night fell over the small shelter, Jonathan felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Exhausted but resolute, he sat in a chair near the window, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. Mary was in the bedroom with the girl, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of tension. Outside, Lewis paced as he spoke quietly on the phone, securing reinforcements to ensure Avery stayed away. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the cascade of events that had led him here. His thoughts drifted to Evelyn, to the bravery she must have shown when she fled with her child, facing dangers he could barely fathom. And now to the girl, who depended entirely on him, his strength, his promise. The crunch of gravel outside snapped him out of his thoughts. His eyes flew open, and he stood, heading to the door. Lewis entered quickly, his expression grave. "We've got a problem," the inspector said. "Avery hasn't backed down. I've got word he's in the area, likely armed. He seems willing to do whatever it takes to get the girl." Jonathan felt a surge of anger. "Then we end this now." Lewis shook his head. "Jonathan, this could turn ugly. If he shows up here, there's no guarantee we can avoid a confrontation." Jonathan glanced towards the small bedroom where the girl was sleeping. "I'm not letting that man anywhere near her. Whatever it takes." Later that night, headlights appeared on the dirt road leading to the shelter. Lewis stood outside with two other officers who had arrived to bolster security. Jonathan, however, stayed inside with Mary and the girl. The vehicle's lights came to a sudden halt, and the sound of a car door slamming echoed through the dark. Jonathan braced himself, his heartbeat quickening. This was the moment they had been anticipating. Avery emerged, walking steadily towards the shelter. Even in the dim light, his presence was menacing. He stopped a few meters from Lewis and the officers, raising his hands as though to show he meant no harm, though everyone could see through the act. "Do you really think you can stop me?" Avery said, his voice calm yet laced with menace. "I just want what's mine." Lewis stepped forward. "Avery, You're on private property. You're under investigation for threats and harassment. I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself." Avery chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that hung in the night air. "You don't get it, do you? That girl isn't just any child. She's mine. Evelyn tried to take that from me, but she's not here to protect her now, is she?" Inside the house, Jonathan heard every word, the rage within him building. This wasn't just about protecting the girl anymore, it was about facing the man who had shattered Evelyn's life and now threatened her daughters. Without hesitation, Jonathan flung the door open and strode out, heading straight for Avery. Mary shouted for him to stop, but he didn't falter. "You're not going to lay a finger on her," Jonathan said, his voice steady, filled with conviction. Avery stared at him, momentarily caught off guard by Jonathan's boldness. "And what are you going to do, Hart? You're just a man with a nice house and a fancy name. That means nothing here." Jonathan stepped closer, meeting Avery's gaze head-on. "You're wrong. It means everything. Because unlike you, I know what it means to care for someone. And I won't let you destroy another life." The tension was electric, but before Avery could respond, Lewis and the officers intervened. "It's over, Avery. You're under arrest for threats and harassment." Avery tried to resist, but the officers quickly subdued him. As they cuffed him, he glanced at Jonathan with a bitter smile. "You think you've won, but this doesn't end here. There will always be people like me." Jonathan stayed silent, watching as Avery was taken away. He knew the man was right, the world was full of threats. But tonight, he had prevailed. And for now, that was enough. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, Jonathan returned inside the shelter. He found the girl awake, sitting on the bed and clutching the coat he had given her. "It's all over," he said softly, sitting beside her. "He's gone. You're safe now." The girl looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "You won't leave me, will you?" Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest, but smiled. "Never. You're part of something much bigger now. And I promise, I'll always be here for you." She leaned in and hugged him, her small hands clutching him tightly. Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had faced danger, the shadows of the past, and even his own vulnerabilities, and in the end, he had chosen to protect the innocence of a life that depended on him. As a new day dawned, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter for both him and the girl. But for the first time, he felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. Standing on the porch, holding the girl's hand, Jonathan looked out at the horizon. He knew he had made the right choice. Protecting this child and honoring Evelyn's sacrifice hadn't just transformed her life, it had changed his as well. The Hart Mansion, once a symbol of power and appearances, now represented something far greater: hope, redemption, and a true home. This story reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, there's always room for courage and kindness. Jonathan chose to protect, to fight, and to do what was right, no matter the odds. And you? What would you do to change someone's destiny? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to share it with your friends and tell us your thoughts in the comments. How would you have acted? Have you ever seen or experienced something like this? For more stories like this, filled with emotion and life lessons, give us a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new content. And don't forget to click the card above to explore the channel's past works that are sure to move you as well. Jonathan's journey may have ended, but the fruits of his choice will endure forever. Thank you for following this story, and remember, every act of kindness can change a life.